What if I told you that an ordinary man had the audacity to fight with God and survived? It sounds impossible, but that's the story of Jacob, a deceiver who tricked his own brother, ran away for years, built an empire, and in the most intense moment of his life, entered a supernatural battle against the Creator himself. And it didn't stop there. He came out of that fight with an eternal mark and a new name. But what made this flawed man the one chosen to carry such a great promise? How did someone fold mistakes, become the father of an entire nation? If you think you already know this story, get ready to see it from a whole new perspective. Jacob wasn't just a biblical character. He was a living symbol that God doesn't choose the perfect. He transforms the imperfect. And if you've ever felt like your life is an endless struggle, this video will show you that even in your worst moments, there is a purpose. But before understanding how Jacob became Israel, you need to know his journey. And it all begins with a fight inside the womb. Have you ever felt like your life is a constant battle, that no matter how hard you try, something is always holding you back? Jacob lived that struggle to the extreme. He wasn't just an ordinary man. He was a born fighter from his mother's womb. He was already fighting for his place in the world. And do you know what's even crazier? Even though he was a deceiver, a fugitive, a man full of flaws, God chose him to carry an enormous promise. Does that seem unfair? Then get ready, because this story will turn your mind upside down. Jacob tricked his own brother, lied to his father, and ran away from home. If he lived today, he'd be that guy who does whatever it takes to get ahead without measuring the consequences. But do you know what detail changes everything? God wasn't looking at his mistakes. He was looking at what Jacob could become. And here's the real question. Are you judging yourself for what you've done, while God is calling you for what you can still become? Jacob thought he was in control of everything, but in the end it was God who shaped him. And his transformation wasn't easy. It was intense, painful. A war. And speaking of war, have you ever heard of someone who had the courage to fight against God himself? Yes, Jacob did that. And not only did he fight, but he walked away from that battle permanently marked. But this story started long before that, before he was even born, in a moment that already foreshadowed that his life would never be normal. The battle began in the womb. Rebecca felt something unusual during her pregnancy. It was as if there was a war inside her, and it wasn't just her imagination. God revealed that those two brothers wouldn't just be rivals, but that the younger would surpass the older. That went against all logic of the time. The firstborn was always the main heir, but God doesn't follow human scripts. When Jacob and Isa were born, the scene already foreshadowed the future. Isa came out first, but Jacob came out grabbing his heel, as if saying, "This place is mine too." Think about it. How many times does life feel like a battlefield, even before you understand the rules? Jacob was born fighting for his space, and maybe you felt like you have to fight all the time, too, but fighting isn't the problem. The problem is how you fight from the beginning. Jacob showed that he was willing to do whatever it took to get ahead, and that ambition led him down a dangerous path, filled with questionable choices and bitter consequences. The question is, how far are you willing to go to get what you believe is yours? His birth already gave hints of his future, but the big turning point came when destiny put the brothers in a moment of weakness. Esau, the physically stronger one, but impulsive; Jacob, the weaker one, but strategic. When hunger hit, a simple meal became the breaking point, and that's when everything started to change. Pay attention, because this might be happening in your life too. What is worth more? A fleeting moment of pleasure or a future of blessings? Esau didn't think twice. He came home starving, exhausted, and Jacob was there waiting, but not just with any food. He had a trap disguised as a warm meal. Do you want this food? Then give me your birthright. And without hesitation, Esau sold his inheritance, his blessing, his future, for a bowl of stew. Yes, he traded everything he could have been for a temporary desire, and guess what? He never got back what he lost. Now look at your life. How many times have you done the same? How many times have you traded what you wanted most for something that only gave you relief for a moment? People sell their dreams for convenience, trade real relationships for quick pleasures, let opportunities slip away because they don't see the value in what they have. Jacob may have been cunning, but at least he understood one thing: blessings aren't something to throw away. And the harsh truth is, if you don't value what you have, someone smarter might take it from you. But hold on, because this story is far from over. Having the birthright wasn't enough. He needed to secure the blessing too. And Jacob knew this better than anyone. What came next wasn't just a trick. It was the move that would change the destiny of an entire nation. The deception was executed. Jacob didn't just want a symbolic title. He wanted the blessing that would transform his destiny. But there was a problem. His father, Isaac, had already decided that Isaac would be the chosen one. But Rebekah, Jacob's mother, didn't accept that, and that's when one of the boldest plans in history was born. Jacob would have to deceive his own father, pretend to be his brother, and take what God had already said was his. He covered his arms with animal skin to seem as hairy as Esau, wore his brother's clothes to smell like him, and prepared his father's favorite meal. When he approached, the old man hesitated. The voice is Jacob's, but the hands are Esau's. And then came the question that would decide everything. Are you really my son Esau? Jacob looked into his father's blind eyes and lied. Without hesitation, yes, I am now. Tell me, how many times have you seen this happen? People disguising themselves, pretending to be something they're not, saying whatever it takes to get what they want. The harsh truth is, in a world where appearance matters more than essence, the best players take the lead. Jacob got what he wanted. Isaac blessed him as the leader, giving him the destiny that should have been Esau's. But here's the part no one tells you. Everything gained through deception comes at the price. Sooner or later, and that price came quickly. When Esau discovered he had been deceived, his fury was uncontrollable. He vowed to kill Jacob, and now the deceiver, who had always been in control, had to face the one thing he never imagined. Yitio ran for his life from that moment on. His life became a race against death, and what happened next changed everything. From hunter to hunted, Jacob spent his whole life playing to win. But do you know what happens when you play with fire? Eventually it burns you. Esau wasn't just angry. He wanted revenge. The plan was simple. If his father died, Jacob would be next. And don't think it was just an empty threat. Esau was a born hunter trained to track and kill. Jacob knew that if he stayed, he would never see the sunrise again. So he did what anyone would do when death comes knocking. He ran, but there's a detail. He wasn't just running from Esau. He was running from his own choices. Now tell me, how many times have you run from something you knew would come back to haunt you? Sooner or later, it could be a wrong decision, a mistake from the past, or a truth you don't want to face. Jacob thought that just running away would free him from the consequences. But guess what? Problems don't disappear just because you pretend they don't exist. And there he was, the man who had taken the blessing and the birthright, now reduced to a fugitive with nothing, no direction, no control. From above, it seemed like his story was heading straight for failure. But God had other plans, because sometimes it's only when we lose everything that we finally hear the voice that truly matters. In the middle of his escape, in the darkest moment of his life, Jacob was caught off guard. He thought he was alone, but God found him in the desert. And what happened that night would change the course of his life forever. Pay attention, Jacob was at his lowest point, running alone, homeless, without family, without anything. The man who had spent his entire life planning every step was now sleeping in the open with a rock as his pillow. Have you ever been at that point when everything falls apart and you realize you have no control anymore? It was exactly there, in the middle of the desert, in the silence of the night, that God broke into Jacob's reality with a vision that changed everything. He saw a ladder connecting heaven and earth, with angels ascending and descending. At the top, God was looking directly at him and saying, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham and Isaac. I am with you and will never abandon you. Now catch this. Jacob never asked for that encounter. He wasn't praying, he wasn't seeking, he wasn't crying out, but God came anyway. Because when he has a purpose for someone, no matter how far you try to run, he will find you. How many times have you thought you were alone, but out of nowhere, something showed you that there was a way? Jacob realized then that God had never left him. It was he who had always tried to do everything his own way. But now, for the first time, he saw that there was something greater. And when you see that, you're never the same again. He woke up in shock, looked around and said, this place is not ordinary. This is the house of God, the gate of heaven. And he did something he had never done before. He built an altar and made a vow to the Lord. But here's an important detail. A vision doesn't change a life if you don't know what to do with it. Jacob still had a long journey ahead, and what awaited him at his next destination would be the greatest test of patience he had ever faced. When Jacob saw Rachel, he knew he wanted her forever. After a life of running, deceiving, and being deceived, he finally found something that made him stop love. But here comes the shock. Getting Rachel wouldn't be easy at all. He arrived in Laban's land, saw Rachel by the well, and it was love at first sight. Determined to have her as his wife, he made a deal he would work 7 years for her. 7 years. But do you know what's even more impressive for Jacob? That time felt like just a few days, because he was in love, but he had no idea that he was about to be the victim of the biggest trick of his life. Now think with me. How many times have you fought for something, invested time, effort, and energy, only to be deceived in the end? Jacob gave his all, and on the wedding night, thinking he had finally won, Rachel Laban tricked him and put Leah, the older sister, in her place. Imagine the scene. Jacob wakes up in the morning, looks beside him, and it wasn't Rachel. He could spend his whole life cheating others, was now tasting the bitter side of deception. The law of return hit him fast, and he realized that the game had turned against him. But the question was, would he give up or keep fighting for what he wanted? Jacob wasn't one to give up easily. He confronted Laban and left with no other option. Accepted the new deal, another 7 years of work for Rachel. His love was so strong that he endured double the time to be with her. But now comes a detail that few notice. Not everything we desperately want will bring peace to our lives. Because after winning Rachel, Jacob discovered that his real struggle hadn't even begun yet. Be careful what you wish for, because it may come with more than you ask for. Jacob wanted a wife but ended up with 4. He wanted a home but built a battlefield. He wanted children but saw his household turn into a stage of jealousy, rivalry, and intrigue. Leah, the wife he never wanted, gave him children first. Rachel, the woman he loved, couldn't get pregnant and was tormented by envy. The atmosphere at home was pure war. The wives competed, the children inherited the rivalry. And without realizing it, Jacob was raising a generation of men who would grow up divided. But here's the craziest part. It was exactly this mess that God was using to form the 12 tribes of Israel. Now pay attention. Sometimes what seems like a disaster is actually part of something much bigger. Jacob thought he was just building a family, but God was laying the foundation of an entire nation. The children were born, and each one carried a name that reflected the pain, struggle, and story of their mothers. And Jacob had no idea that among these boys was one who would change the destiny of them all. Joseph, the son of Rachel, the most beloved, the one who would later lead his family to Egypt. But before all that, Jacob still had to realize that he couldn't live the rest of his life trapped in Laban's manipulations. And then something happened. After years of being exploited, deceived, and drained by his own father-in-law, Jacob realized one thing. He was no longer the man who had fled home alone. Now he had an army, and with this new reality, a radical decision arose. It was time to leave Laban's house, but not by asking for permission. Whoever tries to keep you trapped will eventually have to watch you leave. Jacob arrived at Laban's house as a fugitive, with nothing, but now years later, he was no longer the same. God had made him prosper so much that even Laban, the master trickster, was bothered by it. Jacob's flocks multiplied, his wealth grew, and his influence expanded. The man who once had to beg for work was now a powerful leader. But here's the catch. Prosperity without freedom is just a golden prison. Jacob realized that he could no longer live as a servant to a man who only wanted to drain him. It was time for a radical decision. He had to get out no matter the cost. And that's when he did the unthinkable. Without telling anyone, without asking for permission, he gathered everything that was his wives, children, servants, flocks, and he fled in the middle of the night. Because some battles aren't won through confrontation, but through strategy. Jacob knew that if he tried to leave through the front door, Laban would try to stop him. So he didn't give him a chance. He vanished. He disappeared over the horizon, taking everything he had built. But the problem, Laban wasn't going to let it slide. As soon as he found out, he gathered his men and set out in pursuit. And now Jacob was being hunted. But hold on to this. When God decides to take you out of a place, no one can stop you. The night before the encounter, God appeared to Laban in a dream and gave him a direct warning. Be careful, do not touch Jacob. When they finally met, Jacob was no longer hanging his head low. He was no longer the man who had fled with nothing. He was a leader, a man marked by promise, a warrior ready for whatever was to come. And he didn't know it yet. But the real confrontation was about to happen. because ahead on the road, the greatest enemy from his past was waiting for him. Esau now, it was all or nothing. Jacob had spent his entire life fighting against everything and everyone, against his brother, against his father-in-law, against fate, but now he was facing the greatest confrontation of his life. Esau was coming to meet him with 400 men, and Jacob knew there were no more tricks, no more escape. So he did something he had never done before. He was alone and cried out to God. But instead of a peaceful answer, he was attacked out of nowhere. A mysterious man emerged from the shadows and began to fight him, yes. A real physical, intense fight lasting until dawn. And do you know what's even crazier? That man was God now. Stop and think. Who's the courage to wrestle with God and not let go? Jacob could have given up, but he did the opposite. He clung to God and said, "I will not let you go until you bless me." Do you have any idea what that means? He was tired, wounded, at his limit, but he didn't let go. And then God did something surprising. He touched Jacob's hip and dislocated the joint. With just one touch, God could have knocked him down, ended everything, but Jacob didn't let go. He held on even tighter, and that's when God spoke. The words that would change his life forever. Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and have prevailed. Jacob entered that fight as a deceiver, a fugitive. He came out as Israel, a transformed man but marked forever, because whoever wrestles with God never walks the same way again. Now imagine the scene, dawn breaking, Jacob limping, wounded, but with a new identity. But the battle wasn't over yet, because ahead the greatest test was waiting for him. Esau was coming, the brother who had sworn to kill him. What would happen now? Jacob was ready to die. Esau was approaching with 400 armed men. The last thing Jacob had heard from him was a vow of revenge for years. He carried that fear now. With no tricks, no escape, no masks, he would have to face the brother who had sworn to kill him. And what was the only thing he could do? Bow down 7 times in total surrender. Because for the first time in his life, Jacob understood that this battle wouldn't be won with cleverness, but with humility. Either Esau would kill him, or something impossible would happen. Now imagine the scene, Jacob with his head down, waiting for the final blow. But instead of drawing a sword, Esau did something no one expected. He ran toward Jacob, hugged him, and started crying. This wasn't in the plans. Hatred turned into tears, revenge into forgiveness. What happened there wasn't normal. It was supernatural. Because when God decides to restore something, he doesn't do it halfway. That meeting could have been a bloodbath, but it became a miracle. And do you know what's even crazier? Jacob spent his whole life fighting to get things by force, but it was when he surrendered that God acted. Now tell me, how many times have you run away from something out of fear of the worst, but when you finally had the courage to face it, God had already solved it before you even got there? Jacob thought this was the end, but it was just the beginning of a new chapter. But not everything would be peaceful, because soon he would face a pain no man wants to bear. The loss of the people he loved the most. The pain Jacob was about to endure would be much worse than any enemy. He had finally made peace with Esau. He was settled in Canaan, but life wouldn't let him breathe for long. It was there, in the place of promise, that the greatest tragedies fell upon him like a storm. First, his daughter, Dinah, was violated. Jacob, the man who had fought for every victory, now saw his own household being conquered. And the worst part, his sons, consumed by hatred, took revenge and slaughtered an entire people. Blood was spilled, and suddenly, the family that was supposed to carry the victory was covered in death and violence. The man who had deceived, lost, and fled for so long, now saw his own sons becoming murderers. Was this the legacy he wanted to leave behind? But nothing could have prepared him for the next blow. Rachel died, the woman he had worked 14 years for, the only one he truly loved, was gone during childbirth of their last son, Benjamin. Imagine the despair, Jacob holding Rachel in his arms, watching her life slip away, like sand through his fingers. The man who had wrestled with God, who had won battles, who had built a fortune, now stood completely powerless before death. What good was having everything, if the only thing he truly wanted was taken from him? Some wounds don't heal, they just scar. And now comes the final shock. How many times have you thought you were finally in the right place? But that's where you suffered your greatest losses. Jacob was exactly where God wanted him, but it wasn't easy. The pain crushed him. But in the midst of the tragedy, something greater was happening. What he didn't know was that one of his greatest losses was about to become one of the greatest miracles of his life, because the son he mourned his dead was alive, and this revelation would change everything. When God places something great inside you, be prepared to be hated. Joseph wasn't just any young man. He was Jacob's favorite, the son of the promise, the living reflection of a love Jacob had for Rachel, and that alone was enough to cause jealousy. But Jacob made a fatal mistake. He didn't hide his preference. He made Joseph a special robe, a tunic of vibrant colors that screamed to everyone, "This is the chosen one, now tell me, have you ever seen what happens when someone shines brighter than others?" His brothers didn't just feel envious, they hated him. But what really poured fuel on the fire was the fact that Joseph dreamed. He had visions that one day his brothers would bow before him. And do you know what he did? He told them, imagine the scene. Joseph looking at his brothers and saying, "I dream that you will all bow before me." It was like telling a group of hungry lions that a lamb would rule over them. The hatred reached a new level. Maximum, they decided Joseph would disappear. When he showed up in the field to meet them, the sentence was given, let's kill him. But instead of taking his life, they threw him into a pit and later sold him as a slave. The beloved son was torn from his father's house and taken to Egypt like merchandise. All that was left was his bloodstain, tunic, and the lie that he was dead. Now think about this. How many times has your greatest strength become the reason for your greatest struggle? Joseph was rejected not because he was weak, but because he carried something great. And here comes the truth no one likes to hear. The greater the calling, the greater the battle. But what his brothers didn't know was that by trying to destroy him, they were actually placing Joseph exactly where God wanted him to be. He discovered he was being betrayed, but in reality he was being positioned. Yet before reaching the throne, he had to face betrayal, injustice, humiliation, and prison, because every great dream must first pass the desert test. The game turned. Joseph's brothers thought they had gotten rid of him, but now they were about to bow before the very man they had betrayed. Years passed and famine struck the land hard. Canaan was on the brink of collapse, and the only hope was Egypt, the very place where Joseph was now governor. Yes, that young man sold as a slave was now in charge of distributing food for the entire nation. But his brothers didn't know that. They only knew they were hungry, desperate, and needed to beg for help. So they traveled to Egypt, and without realizing it, they knelt before their own brother. Joseph's dream was fulfilled right before their eyes. Now think about this. Could it be that sometimes God leads you to a place that seems unfair, but in reality, it's just positioning for something greater? Joseph suffered, was betrayed, imprisoned, forgotten, but it was all part of a plan. And now, standing before the man who had sold him, he had absolute power over them. He could have taken revenge. He could have destroyed each one. But do you know what he did? He tested them. He wanted to see if they had changed, if they were still the same cruel men. And when he saw that his brother, Benjamin, was in danger and Judah offered to protect him, Joseph couldn't hold back any longer. He ordered everyone to leave the room, looked at his brothers and said, "I am Joseph, the brother you sold." Now imagine the shock, the fear. They were standing before the man they had tried to destroy, and now their lives were in his hands. But Joseph didn't want revenge. He wanted restoration. And here comes the greatest lesson. When God puts you on top, the true victory is not in getting revenge. It's in forgiving. Jacob, who had spent his entire life believing Joseph was dead, was now about to receive the most unbelievable news of all. The son he had wept for years was still alive. But the story wasn't over yet, because now the entire family had to leave Canaan and move to Egypt. And this move wasn't just about survival. It was the beginning of something much greater. Then came the moment. No one could escape the end of the journey. Jacob, the man who wrestled with God, deceived, fled, lost, rebuilt, and survived, was now facing his final breath. But before leaving, he had one last thing to do. Prophesy the future. His sons gathered around his bed, and one by one, they received words that would echo for generations. This wasn't just a farewell. It was a verdict. Judah was chosen from his lineage. A king would come. Joseph received double victories. But for some the words were harsh, because here comes a brutal truth. What you plan in life, you will reap in the end. Now imagine the scene. Jacob, weak, lying down, but with eyes still burning, with a fire of everything he had lived. He looked at his sons and didn't just see men. He saw tribes, nations, an entire future unfolding before him. But he knew one thing: Egypt was not the final destination. His people belonged in Canaan, so he made one last request. Do not bury me here, take me to the land of promise. And after that, something great happened. He took his last breath and departed, not as a fugitive, not as a deceiver, but as a patriarch now. Think about this: everything he had lived through, everything he had suffered, every betrayal, every struggle, every miracle, it was all part of a much greater plan. But the story doesn't end here, because on the horizon, something was about to happen that would change the destiny of his people forever. Egypt, once a refuge, would soon become a prison, and a new figure would rise, someone named Moses. The next chapter of the story was just beginning. Now tell me, did you see what happened here? Jacob spent his entire life trying to win, by his own means, deceiving, running, manipulating. But in the end, the greatest victory of his life came when he was confronted by God himself. He entered the fight as a deceiver and left as Israel, the man who would carry the promise of an entire nation. And now I ask you, how many times have you found yourself struggling alone, trying to do things your way, failing and wondering why nothing works out? Maybe God isn't against you. Maybe he's forcing you to stop and realize it's time to change. Jacob only received his victory when he decided not to let go of God, even wounded, even tired, even limping. Now answer me. Are you willing to hold on until the end, or will you give up halfway? If this story moves you, don't leave without subscribing to the channel. Activate notifications and stay tuned, because we still have a lot to talk about. Now comment here, which part of Jacob's story impacted you the most? What did this struggle with God teach you? I want to hear your opinion.